I sat there in numerous, kind of like dirty history type things, and not a nice word was said. It was truly dirty history. Vicious, and they have no sympathy or no time for you. And that's partly that Slavic culture.
Yeah, part of the problem is that some of us occasionally, as opposed to watching the war, information.
Oh, there we go. Let's see. All right. Let's see if this works. Can you guys? Is the speaker on in the back? Yeah. Is it? Let me see. Laptop 80 HDMI. Okay. You guys can hear? All right. Hey everybody, welcome on Twitch and welcome in person. In particular, so glad that you guys are here. I want to talk today about the difference that freedom made in the conduct of the war. We talked about how the war was fought in the first year and a half, and I'll quickly go over that and then talk about how the war changes in part because of the difference that freedom made. It's important to understand, I think, Lincoln's position. To understand that Lincoln was not committed to ending slavery in the South when the war started, and his reasoning for that had to do with, as we saw, the butternut and copperhead regions of the North, wanting to make sure that Kentucky and Tennessee would stay on the Union side to get the support of slaveholding folks in Maryland who were voters. So all of this is part of his calculation. Unfortunately, and while Lincoln is opposed to slavery, his leading general in the beginning of the war, George McClellan, is not opposed to slavery, in fact believes strongly in slavery, and takes every opportunity to return enslaved people to their putative owners during this conflict. He says not a single fence post will be overturned as this army moves slowly up to Richmond. And I want to talk about how and why warfare changes as slavery becomes an issue. So let's go here. Just a reminder, this is the Butternut region. The Butternut region and the Copperhead region are basically in the north, but places where white Southerners are in large numbers and sympathize to a certain extent with the South. There's also opposition to secession and sometimes even opposition to slavery in eastern North Carolina and western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee, in that dotted region there. And in the German regions, say in north of Louisiana there in Arkansas and in East Texas. All right, we talked a little bit about the first secession and the second secession. That's what historians call them. It's actually just one secession, but it's not until Lincoln calls for troops from the southern states or from all the states, that Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas secede as well. They join secession. And this has a lot to do. The difference between the lower South and the upper South is visible in the percentage of enslaved population in those regions. And talked about war bonds and railroads. Okay, so jump ahead, we talked about the problems of intelligence and problems of logistics, moving people around. Towards the end, someone asked if Confederate soldiers had to cross over the Grapevine Bridge, and no, they didn't. Basically, the Confederates were able to take advantage of the fact that half of the Union Corps, wait me a second, half of the Union Corps was on one side of the Grapevine Bridge, the other half was on the other side, and basically the Confederates could stay on the eastern side of that river, the Chickahominy, and Union troops were not going to cross the Chickahominy unless they crossed the Grapevine Bridge. So it put them in a position of defending across a river, which is an ideal defense position. So it does lead the Union to retreat in part when the Confederates go around and get behind Union lines, and then Union Army is forced to retreat from Richmond in 1862. And so a year after the war is started, this massive campaign of 130,000 Union soldiers basically retreats. Okay. So a little bit about emancipation, because you probably have heard that enslaved people are freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, but that's not really true. It's a more complicated story, and it's in part conflict between Congress and the president about emancipation. So first of all, the first person to act in a way that's somewhat effective is Benjamin Butler, who declares that enslaved people who are working on fortifications are contraband of war, and they will not be returned to Confederate lines. In August of 1861, Congress passes the first Confiscation Act that orders enslaved people captured while working on military projects, or orders that those people are seized property and will not be returned to captivity. So basically formalizes what Benjamin Butler says, which is if you're an enslaved person and you're working on fortifications for the Confederacy and you escape, then there's no point in returning you to behind Confederate lines, because you'll be used as in the war on the Confederate side. In July of 1862, in the Second Confiscation Act, Congress declares that enslaved people owned by those who sided with the Confederacy are forever free. So this is well before Lincoln, but it's at this point that the Union it controls by July of 62, I think, New Orleans, it controls Eastern Virginia, it controls Eastern North Carolina, but it doesn't really control much of Georgia or South Carolina, and so it doesn't have a whole lot of effect. Shortly after, Lincoln announces that he will proclaim that enslaved people in states still under rebellion will be free, and then in January of 63 he declares that slavery is ended, but only in the seceding states. So that means in Maryland, right, which is in the Union, Tennessee, which is in the Union, that slavery still exists in those places. Now, there's what presidents and Congress declares, and then what's actually happening on the ground. What's actually happening on the ground is lots of people are freeing themselves. They're going behind Union lines. They're establishing themselves in these camps called Contraband Camps, and they're increasingly, because they need to eat, and because the Union is providing them with food, but for work, what we're seeing is the Union is employing many, many more black men, in particular, over the ages of 18 in the Union Army. First, as what are called, pioneers, basically people who are cutting trees and making space. Also as teamsters, people who are carrying goods from place to place. And it's only later, by 64, that we start to see large numbers of black soldiers being recruited into the Union Army. Okay. What ultimately allows the Union to win is another kind of social revolution, really the collapse of slavery behind Union lines. The next step for the Union Army by 1863 is to, I'm going to jump back to a map. Sorry here, I'm not trying to give you guys epilepsy. If you look there in, you see Memphis there on the Mississippi River. There are, General Hunter in the Union begins to establish a policy of raiding. So what is raiding? Raiding is basically attacking supply lines, and so Confederates have been attacking Union supply lines really from the beginning of the war. But Union raiders do something different. Union raiders like Hunter raid southern plantations. They will shoot some artillery towards a plantation house. They'll come into the plantation, they'll announce to enslaved people that they are all free, and then they'll leave. And what this does is to destabilize these southern regions for both black and white people. Black people are formerly enslaved people are leaving, and they're trying to go into these contraband camps. But there is a kind of humanitarian crisis for formerly enslaved people, because it's not, food provision is not straightforward. People are kind of making a decision whether to stay on the plantation, where with a kind of usually not very well liked enslaver, or behind Union lines in the contraband camps. Many go behind Union lines in the contraband camps. But this raiding by Hunter and others prevents food production on plantations. The final step is recruitment of black soldiers. There's often, oh, sorry, I'm not looking at I realized my, oh, okay. Yes, the final exam is the same format as the past two exams, and it's worth the same as the other two exams. So it's not the exam will not be cumulative, it'll be on the last third. Okay, and I'm sorry, I'm going to open up the Slido so that I can see the questions. All right. So the way in which the Civil War story is often told is a story about Robert E. Lee versus McClellan, and the war is told as a kind of chess battle. A dozen what ifs, a dozen Monday morning quarterbacks. What if the Union had moved it here? What if Pickett's charge at Gettysburg had been worked differently? And they tend to personalize the Army through Lee and McClellan. And this is unfortunately gives the impression that McClellan was just slow and not a very good general, and that Lee was a brilliant general. When this class was taught, say, 40 years ago, there would have been a big sandbox here in this part of the room, and little soldiers would be lined up, and you'd go through each of the battles in the Civil War. What I'd like to do, though, is get us away from this history of individual generals. I had a student a few years ago who wrote a piece about McClellan and said that as everyone knows, McClellan was a wuss. He designed a saddle that would be comfortable. It's clear that someone who designs a comfortable saddle isn't comfortable in a saddle, and is therefore not worthy of being a general, and that he didn't advance quickly enough. It's true that McClellan's army didn't advance very quickly, but it's got nothing to do with McClellan himself and everything to do with those supply lines for the Union Army. First of all, let's talk about I want to talk about before McClellan and after McClellan. We went through one of the major battle, the Peninsular Campaign, a major series of battles, the Peninsular Campaign, and talk about what happens before and after McClellan steps down. Let's start with intelligence. McClellan used balloons and his Secret Service Corps. Why did McClellan think that Johnston, the Confederate, had a massive force north and east of Virginia, only to discover that the rifled artillery that seemed to be there were actually logs painted black at the end, that the Confederacy did not have any artillery lined up. The New York papers called these Quaker guns because they weren't really guns at all. One part of the answer lies with McClellan's obsessive fascination with technology. McClellan never met a piece of hardware that he didn't like, from siege engines to saddles. McClellan thought he could out-engineer the Confederate Army. After 1863, after McClellan's failure to capture Richmond, a new branch of military intelligence was created. The Aeronautics Corps was drastically shrunk and mostly used for mapping. The new intelligence corps for the Union Army was black informants. Direct reports from escaped slaves, who by 1863 could be sure of their freedom, this is after the Emancipation Proclamation, went straight to generals. Thus, in military reports you see by 1863 and 1864, reports that say a deserter said that troops were here, a refugee said troops were there, contrabands said that troops were here. Rather than being created in elaborate reports that justify this existence of a separate bureau, generals themselves received direct reports from enslaved people who were in fact feeding the army, were in fact supplying the army, and knew precisely where people were. If we think about the war as a chess match, the coming of war over slavery in a new intelligence office meant that the general goes from thinking that the other side of the board is crowded with pieces to having a better, more realistic picture of the other side. And this is primarily what allows the Union Army to defeat, or helps the Union Army to defeat the Confederacy. Secondly, logistics. Recall the bridges built during the war. An engineering corps would build these roads using soldiers on what was called fatigue duty. Sorry, bouncing around through my pictures again. Oh, right, there we are. What was called fatigue duty. And these soldiers weren't especially good at building roads. And the Union Army had a great deal of artillery. Each regiment had a dozen carts for supplies. They had a separate quartermaster's corps, which provided food. They also had a sanitary commission and a military hospital. There would be frequently fistfights between regiments over the boundaries between their camps. This corduroy road that was the Grapevine Bridge was built with the oversight of the New York engineers, and soldiers resented this work. It was very hot and very wet. There was, in fact, a great increase in sickness in the men. It spread in part by walking through mud. So walking through mud is, if you get past your shoe, there's a very good chance of getting ringworm. People also regularly turned in sick or claimed to be sick when they were given fatigue duty. And that's the Chickahominy Bridge. By comparison, during the war, Confederates had great bridges. Claiborne Mason, for example, was responsible for bridge building for Robert E. Lee and much of the Peninsular Campaign. He was a railroad boss who had hundreds of enslaved people drafted from nearby counties. And the story was that Confederate engineers would draft a bridge across the Chickahominy, this is towards the end of the conflict, for chasing after Union soldiers, working hurriedly in tents. Mason marches off with 200 or more enslaved people and returns that same day, 4 hours later, and says to the engineers, "I built them bridges for you. Are you done with your picture?" So this is what, by embracing the end of slavery, the U.S. creates an organization called the Pioneer Corps. And the Pioneer Corps paid formerly enslaved people, black enlistees, to rebuild roads. And these were people, by and large, who knew how to build roads, having built them throughout the South for the last 8 to 10 years. They dug the trenches for the canal outside of Vicksburg in the attack on Vicksburg. They also built railroad bridges. Herman Haupt was the engineer on the Pennsylvania Railroad. He had a colonel's commission, and he became the head of the U.S. military railroad. So as the Union moved through a region, they would take over the region, and of course the bridges would be destroyed. But Haupt, using formerly enslaved men and using advanced engineering, built impressive, rapidly built impressive transportation. So this is a quote from Lincoln. That man Haupt had built a bridge 400 feet long and 100 feet high across Potomac Creek, on which loaded trains are passing every hour. And upon my word, gentlemen, there's nothing but corn stalks and bean poles. These bridges, built very quickly by the Union Army, were built entirely by formerly enslaved men. The use of drafted or hired enslaved men increased rapidly after the Peninsular Campaign, after McClellan was gone. They also built and rebuilt roads for Sherman's advance from Chattanooga to Atlanta, December of 1863, into the Atlanta Campaign. Now, you've probably heard about the Sherman's March to the Sea, if you're from Georgia. You've heard about Sherman's March into Atlanta and the burning of Atlanta, and how Sherman's men basically create a wide corridor, almost a mile wide, that burns cotton gins, cotton houses, tobacco houses, and things like that throughout the South. Behind, though, Sherman's men was a railroad corridor that brought them food. So they didn't live off the land. That's the story that Sherman's men told later. They didn't live off the land. They lived off a provisioning corridor that stretched from Jeffersonville, Indiana, all the way around through Chattanooga up to Atlanta, and then all the way to the sea. So as they're moving, they're building this railroad corridor that's feeding them from the Midwest. Who's building the railroad corridor? Again, it's formerly enslaved people. Over 150,000, right? That's bigger than the army that McClellan had. Over 150,000 men building these railroad corridors. And Sherman's men received double rations in this because it was exhausting, apparently, to burn people's houses down. So they got double rations as they moved, and all those rations were provided by the formerly enslaved. So this is important, and it makes U.S. Grant much faster, much more capable of moving through these, and make Sherman's men much faster as well as this regular logistic support. So, why was McClellan so slow? He didn't allow black men to work for the Union Army. Large portions of his soldiers were slowed by inefficient road building. If we think again about the context of chess, the policy change of embracing the end of slavery meant that you take a bunch of pieces on the other person's side and make them your own, right? That those black men and women who had been providing the food for the Confederacy are being drawn away and then supporting the Union. This is kind of on the backs of black men and women who are in these contraband camps. So that's logistics. The third thing that's important to understand about the period, intelligence is number one, and intelligence improves drastically once you start to basically believe black people who are coming across lines and giving you information. McClellan did not believe this, and he led everything with his corps, his own little intelligence corps. That's intelligence. Logistics improved drastically once slavery ended because there's this labor force that's being paid by the Union Army to do this work. Third is morale. Now, emancipation was unpopular, and it may have embittered many white Southerners and driven some of them into the Army, and may have led some to fight in the last ditch to defend slavery. But I think the story is more complicated than that. The Peninsular Campaign, despite McClellan's attempt to make it look otherwise, was still an invasion. He may not have sacked every farm between Yorktown and Richmond, but many still thought of McClellan as an invading force, many white people. And no amount of friendship towards planter families, no amount of rebuilding fences and stuff like that was going to fix that sense of invasion. By the end of the Peninsular Campaign, the Confederate Congress became desperate. They created the Conscription Act that declared every white man a soldier, a Partisan Ranger Act that created Confederate guerrillas. A fear of slave insurrections led to something called a 20 Negro rule, that if you managed, or you were in a district that had more than 20 enslaved people, one person could be exempted from service. This makes many poorer farmers angry. As the Union moved in, states that had few Confederate troops were still voting in Congress, even though they had very few soldiers in the field. And this is important because, for example, Missouri, Arkansas, and Florida, which have almost no soldiers, Missouri is technically in the Union, but the Confederacy also claims to have a Missouri representatives in Congress. Same thing with not Maryland, Tennessee. They also have Tennessee representatives, even though Tennessee is in the Union. But these people represent almost nobody. And the Confederate Congress increasingly represents fewer and fewer people. The way that the Confederacy responds to the threat of the end of slavery is to increasingly tax farmers. And this drives many farmers into opposition to the war. They call it a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. This sort of constant raids by Confederate soldiers of farmers and others. Most of the pigs in South Carolina and Georgia, eastern North Carolina, and parts of Virginia are all gone by 1864, by the Confederate Army, which has basically taken all of the pigs in these regions. All right, so this political polarization is important. For Union soldiers, on the other hand, increasingly as they see slavery firsthand, as they see formerly enslaved people firsthand, are unwilling to give those enslaved people back, even though, say in 1862, they're told that they have to. They have guns, and they're not going to allow planters to come into a region and take people back out again. Morale improves by 64 and 65, in part as this becomes a war over slavery, because it makes it possible for people to have a kind of cause that's more than just bringing the South back in, right? Secession and bringing the South back in isn't as strong a motivation for some soldiers, and an explanation for death as strong as the abolition of slavery in the South, the punishment of secessionists. And so the morale in the Union Army improves, and morale in the Confederate Army declines as slavery becomes an issue. The best predictor of who will, and so what you see then in the Confederate Army is the Army just fades away. There are so many desertions from Confederate regiments. That regiment is supposed to have, the regiments go from, sort of 80% capacity or something like that to something like 20% or 15%. And so there are a bunch of regiments that just have a few dozen people in them by the end. And you've had lots and lots of people, Confederates, who have just left the Army and returned home, unwilling to fight. And this is ultimately, when we get to Appomattox in April of 1865, Lee does not have an army. He has very, very few people left in the army to fight for him. So morale as the Confederacy becomes more desperate, as it starts to grind people, even though the war is about slavery, and even though initially people believed that defending slavery was a good thing, increasingly even Southerners, many white Southerners, believe that this war is too costly. This is a pontoon bridge, also just more about logistics, that Confederates, Union soldiers built in May of 1864, which it's sort of ingenious, but it's built in the space of basically 2 days, allowing soldiers to move quickly. Finally, so intelligence, logistics, and morale. The end of slavery, which takes some time, increasingly improves Union intelligence, improves Union logistics, improves Union morale. The fourth thing that's very important for understanding this war is, again, bonds. Again, you have to have some way to pay for all this stuff. Neither the Union nor the Confederacy has enough to spend the $5 million a year it costs in 1860 dollars to operate this conflict, to continue this conflict. And it's here on the question of bonds that once the war becomes a war over slavery, there's much more support for buying bonds in Europe. The Union Army is, there's one attempt to issue bonds by the Confederate Army called the Erlinger Loan. It basically fails. It does not generate much capital or cash for the Confederate Army. The Union Army, on the other hand, is, once the war becomes a war over slavery, gets people in the major cities of Europe to buy Union bonds. That is, to provide the money and then be paid back over time by the United States government. And the United States government honors all those commitments over time, although it takes 25 years to pay off this war. And as I said before, it's a great, kind of fascinating new State Department in the Republican Party that is going to prefigure a lot of American intervention in the rest of the world afterwards. Charles Francis Adams was the formal delegate to Great Britain from the United States. And the Secretary of State, Thurlow Weed, is it Thurlow Weed? Yes, Secretary of State Thurlow Weed basically ignored him. And rather than appeal directly to the king or to Parliament, the new Republican Party under Weed basically appealed to people directly. So Charles Francis Adams wrote later, after the war was over, that Seward did not propose to depend altogether on the traditional accredited representatives of the country, including him, right? Charles Francis Adams is John Quincy Adams' son. He's John Adams' grandson. He thinks that everybody should pay attention to him because he's, the son and grandson of presidents. But what they do is influence European public opinion by using men like John Bigelow, who was just a charge d'affaires, which is somebody who basically figures out passports. And he is the person who advertises in France and in Ireland and in Great Britain that if you that there's free land in the West, and all you have to do is sign a contract to come to the U.S. to get your free land. When men arrive to sign that contract, they realize that the contract they've signed is to join the Union Army. And so there are hundreds of thousands of people who are effectively drafted from abroad by the U.S. government in 1864 and 1865. One of my great-grandfathers was lured into this scheme from Ireland and ends up, great-great-grandfathers, ends up fighting much against his will in the Union Army. The other thing that happens is that Robert Walker, who had produced the Walker Tariff, he's a Southerner, he's a planter, but he decides to support the Union. He goes abroad and he points out that Jefferson Davis repudiated the Mississippi debts. And he says, in this pamphlet, Jefferson Davis, Repudiation, Recognition, and Slavery. And he says the Southerners not only represent slavery, they also repudiate their debts. They're not going to pay them back. The Union is going to pay them back. And so when it comes to bonds, the Union does extremely well in Europe and is able to basically fund the conflict for much longer than the Confederacy is. So, making the war about emancipation, the people who push for this are not, in fact, the president nor Congress at first. It's in fact black men who, and then women and then children who cross over Union lines and force the hand of the Union Army, saying they have emancipated themselves, what's the Union going to do? As the Union adjusts to this, as the Union adjusts to the fact that slavery is collapsing in the South, intelligence, logistics, morale, and bonds, all of those actually benefit the Union. That the war, by the time the Union finally embraces ending the war, with slavery ended as well, it's a very different kind of war, and one which the Union is capable of winning. Okay, that's all I had for today. The final exam is going to be in the same format. I'm going to talk about the railroad legend John Henry on Wednesday, and we'll be talking more about how the war ends. You'll notice that I'm a little bit ahead of Harry Watson, and that's because Harry Watson's obsessed by the Jacksonian period. So we'll, again, the exam is not cumulative, and look forward to seeing you guys on Wednesday. Thanks again. Oh, and I will post, I apologize for being slow in having the lectures on YouTube. They're gonna get there shortly. Thanks.